Chapter 2. First Steps. My name is Elior Listander. His grin grew slightly, and he placed his top hat back upon his head, tipping it toward me again. His tall frame cast a shadow over me as he slipped by and greeted the captain in charge of our expedition. His voice remained an echo inside my mind, sprouting tranquility beyond reasoning. "Quiet!" a bulky brute boomed to grab our attention. I recognized the man as Bartus Pekarin, a veteran explorer who often taught at Langdon University in whipping students into shape. The man was born with a hardened, cut muscle frame and raspy vocal cords from too much grunting during his wild exercises within his mother's womb. The fact he was never dry simply made me wonder if he was more amphibious than human. The sweat dripping off his face seeped through his clothing made him frightfully unattractive, but apparently only to me. Every girl in school ogled him as a fantastic specimen. I would not be surprised if most of them followed him into his bachelor's lair. "We have a pressing assignment," Bartus continued. "I look around here today and see some who will not make it back." I do not know why his eyes shot back at me when he said that. Yet I turned about and kept my gaze upon the man in mystic midnight, speaking with the captain. The two of them appeared as if they knew one another and carried on with their private conversation. Suddenly, I heard the brute exclaim, "Let's move out!" Elior and the captain slowly turned from their conversation and began making their way to follow the rest of us. Bartus stepped quickly in front of the MKR, his face breaking all barriers of proximity to one's respectable distance. "We have a MKR accompanying us," Bartus scoffed. "Let us hope that your sorcery does not attract the dangers of the wilds while bumping around down there." "If danger rears its face to harm us, I am sure your breath is more than adequate to keep it at bay," Elia calmly replied, receiving a bit of a chuckle from the captain who stood just behind him. I covered my mouth to keep any squeals of laughter from escaping. Bartus sneered at the comment but did not budge. Something strange happened though when I blinked. Elia was suddenly standing behind Bartus, yet he had no time to sidestep around the bulky man. Bartus appeared baffled as I did. I observed the captain, who chuckled again, and then caught up to Elior, moving away from us. Just the brute and I remained. I did not care for that at all, and I scurried to catch the rest of the pack. Realizing I had just taken my first step outside the dwelling gates and into the wilds of the Deadlands, my heartbeat began reverberating. Even the boasting brats who were puffed up before we left were lockjawed, not even a peep. I kept behind them, but not too far. A woman who I could tell was a veteran explorer slicked back her stony hair with streaks of heaven. I thought she held an extraordinary elegance, even with the slight wrinkles beneath her eyes and lines tiptoeing into her face. She smiled at me and then moved in close to whisper in my ear, "My name is Zenobia." Her voice came across as somewhat gruff, but remained pleasant. That is when I noticed the large scar on her throat, somewhat covered by a tan hide cloth she had wrapped around her neck. "You must be Agnea Nim." I could not recall whether I had met Zenobia before or not. Something about her felt familiar, but I could not place it. I shook away the thoughts racing through my mind, realizing my rudeness in not answering her. "Yes," I replied softly. "How do you know me?" She clarified that I was a small girl when my father brought me to ride my first warship. Zenobia was the captain of that ship at the time, the Cloud Guard of Westmain, now a retired vessel in the fortified city of Harbinger. "I do," I almost burst out too loudly. "That was the day I fell in love with airships. But my apologies if I do not remember you." Zenobia smiled, letting me know that my memory was not crucial. After leaving the military, she clarified that she had sustained her friendship with my father, and she had joined the expedition to see me home safely as a favour to him personally. I do not consider myself a crier, but my eyes swelled up with tears. My father has always found it challenging to show he loves me. So, in his own way, he finds a means to communicate it occasionally. The group stopped and stared at what I had heard so many times about, the Deadlands. We had trekked not more than an hour or so from the dwelling gates, yet we had ceased for the moment at a ledge displaying a wide-open view of flora in lush hues I could only dream about wearing, and diverse landscapes, forests, a marsh, and a desert all within our gaze. I had only surveyed such things from above, high in the clouds, A chill made its way up my spine, and the sweat on my brow became cool. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably, and then I felt someone clasp one of them. I thought it was Zenobia, but I peered down to see a mystic midnight glove. I peered upward at Elior's grin, which brought a great calm over me. I reached up with my other hand, wiped the sweat from my brow, and heard him quietly tell me not to be afraid. The MKR moved away but motioned me to follow him. The captain and a few of the soldiers accompanied our footsteps. The others remained stationary, still talking and staring out over the horizon. I saw Elior halt at a tree, not much taller than him. The sun was gleaming down through the rest of the tall, quercus foliage surrounding us. I had never seen a spectacle such as sunlight dancing amid the branches of what is known as a glade. The books I had read about such sights were not even close to what I had fathomed. The moment tore my imagination apart, and I realised I was about to venture further into the dangers of the wilds, and my mother always taught me that beauty always leads to a beast. Speaking of beasts, Bartus grunted as he approached the gathering in the glade with the rest of the group in tow. The captain, with us, motioned for him to be silent. Elior stood very still, his eyes closed, and I could feel his strange peace bubble up inside me again. But I could see something, light coming out from his eyelids. Even with his eyes closed, it could not be hidden. The light went away almost just as quickly as it had appeared. Then Elior opened his eyes. The captain stared at him for a moment. Elior playfully shouted, "There lies our course!" and pointed. Bartus nearly fell over and quickly retorted for Elior to keep his voice down. "He would not put us in danger," the captain calmly reprimanded him. "We can all save our hushed tones until otherwise instructed." The second in command to the captain announced to the new explorers as Elior, the captain, and the others began trekking in the direction the MKR had pointed out. We were told to stick close to the veteran explorers and the soldiers and not to leave the safety of the party. "We cannot protect you if we do not know where you are." I rushed to be by Elior's side, as I had several questions twirling through me. I had never seen an MKR use magic, and my curiosity erupted from all corners of my mind. However, my mother's voice kept my mouth from flapping, hearing her tell me how improper it was to blurt out questions without first getting to know someone. "Are you really going to remain silent, miss?" I heard Elior's voice reach me when I had just managed to pace my stride with his. "I will not be offended by your questions, I promise." "Please, good sir, you may call me Agnea," I replied. "Well, Agnea, I thank you for permission to be informal." Elior's eyes spiraled to a new coloration with his pleasant smile. "And if I may be so bold, please, you may call me Elior." I did not hesitate to ask my questions after the pleasantry of our permission to be informal. I was intrigued by the spectacle of what Elior had performed back in the glade, that it probably came off rude and prying by firing off so many inquiries. Yet he indulged my curiosities with great patience and a handful of chuckles that made me believe he enjoyed my company. The first thing I inquired of, in almost a demanding tone, was his abilities in the use of magic, beginning with what he had performed in the glade. He stunned me with his explanation of what he called his mystic memory, referencing his ability as light-touching knowledge, where he acquired memories of objects, time, and places that allowed him to recall certain things the light of sun touched, including landscapes in the now forever-changing Deadlands. This ability revealed to him what was and what now was, allowing him to find the correct navigable path no matter what had changed within the environment. I felt my eyes widen as I could not fathom what I heard. "What about people?" I asked. "Can you remember people? Do you spy on them, observe them all the time?" "I do not wish to know anyone, less I wish to know them," the MKR replied. "You cannot truly get to know someone by observation alone. Perceiving gives us an angle, often filled with follies due to our inadequacies. To truly know someone, one must talk and interact." Taken in by his philosophical tenor, I did not realise I had whipped out my notepad to jot down his words. After 5 years of university education, I was apparently still taking notes for an examination later. "Will you tell me more about what you can do?" I swiftly responded. I knew it came across as impolite, but I could also see Zenobia beside me, nudging me to continue my interrogation. She must have found it fascinating as well. Elior just beamed and began explaining some of the other abilities he could perform with certainty and ease, all of which kept me enthralled. By nightfall, I had my face in my journal next to the fire. I did my best to remember and write down what Elia had described about his power, precisely what he called bright bending, referring to his ability to project his frame in one place, then to another, before an additional moment had passed. I could only imagine he did this when Bartus invaded his personal space at the dwelling gates in Langdon. Another described to me was something that worked in tune with his mystic memory, where Elior could feel light. By feeling light in a specific place, he could get to know the region without being physically present. I had asked him if he could feel people when using this ability, to which he replied, "No, just the light touching them." I was unsure what that meant, but I recorded it nonetheless. We sat around the campfire, all the young graduates huddled together. The explorers made an inner circle, and the soldiers surrounded us along the outer rim. That night I learned the names of my fellow postgraduates as they engaged me with negligible curiosity. Garvish, the loudest of the six, made known his boyish conquests during his days at the university. His slender frame was not weak, but fitly cut like many boys I met at Langdon trying to have a good time. I admit his sphere-eye, creme veil appearance remained not bad to look upon, yet he was highly boastful, constantly running his fingers through his gold hair and bringing up his specialty in studying strategic marksmanship and survival tactics that convinced the others of his prowess. However, I remained convinced he would not conquer the wilds so virile. Pramyan held a very high intellect, I shall admit, yet I pinned him as the type who would raise his hand in a classroom and bluntly announce to the professor they forgot to assign studies for the class to take home. I could relate to him in my love for learning, but not on that level. He constantly debated with the others, trying to outmatch them with his wit. His specialty was documentation, extraction, and knowledge preservation. Another way to say one belongs indoors reading books. The fact his eye spectacles were neatly tied around his head told me he would be blind without them. He was a scrawny, oval, eye-pale face, but oddly enough, there was strength in his hands. Jish and Farid were unmistakable athletes, with creme veil skin, sphere eyes, and dark cocoa hair, constantly sizing one another up in a competitive yet playful demeanour. I soon learned they were teammates for all 5 years of their studies at Langdon. They had both studied to specifically become explorers, specialising in medicinal assiduity and applied kinesiology practices. It was comforting to have two individuals capable of patching me up if some monster in the wilds or the unlight took a bite out of me. Bikama had incredible oval eyes with a light touch of gold in his cocoa skin. He had straight, shoulder-length sable hair, elegantly brushed and tied behind his head, but he jawed off like the rest. He had participated in several campus organisations to become an explorer specialising in authoritative communication, bionavigation and weaponry engineering. His accolade symbols tattooed down his arms are what pompous Langdon graduates do when they cannot show off the hunk of metal stashed somewhere in a glass case. Bikama had an entire showroom of his awards displayed like artefacts in a museum-like fashion at his family's estate. These boys were all born of Westmain. Nanasha, though, was much different from the rest. He was slenderly fit like Garvish, but a bit shorter. He was a Nodian oval-eye sable face, with short curly sable hair, who had ventured to study in a foreign land. His eyes seized a bright cocoa shimmer, smooth like his sable skin. Apparently he was not as comfortable speaking about his accomplishments as the other boys, due to his thick accent. Yet he communicated his specialties, musculoskeletal therapies and botany biology, when they asked him. "What did you study?" Pramyan's voice reached me across the campfire as I remained jotting in my journal. "Psychological premonition and secret arts," I replied, peering up from the pages. The entire gathering of boys suddenly went utterly silent. I knew the reason why, but I refused to be ashamed of my curiosities of enchanting and magic. Most people think studying the secret arts is a waste of time if you're not already a keeper, but a massive part of our world is typically ignored regarding the MKR. I had studied several articles interviewing Elior. None revealed much other than praising his accomplishments. "Are you a keeper?" Pramyan asked. I shook my head. "Am I to gather that you spent all your time studying how to read emotions and magic, yet you are not even a keeper?" Garvish scoffed with a snicker or two, pulling back his overpriced, textured golden locks. Jish and Farid joined in the laughter, while Bikama added in his scorn. "What are you doing out here?" Bikama interjected. "Why would you study magic if you are not a keeper? Your parents must be proud." "Trap it, you nit!" I spat, feeling my anger rush to my head as I stood up. I did not realize my hand had grasped the grip of my drill gun. Looks like someone studied emotions but didn't learn how to control them, Garvish continued his mockery. I turned quickly away from the group and marched off toward my tent. Tears enveloped and streamed down my face, but I was hidden by the shadows, hopefully. Zenobia joined me in the tent when I set foot inside and dropped into a huddled mess on the ground. She said nothing. She walked over to me and slowly sat down where I lay on my wilderness bedding, hearing me sobbing as softly as possible. I felt her arms, and then she ran her fingers through my hair. However, all I could think about was putting a bit between the eyes of Bikama and the other three. I awoke late that night, assuming I had cried myself to sleep. Zenobia lay resting soundly, no more than an arm's length away. The strangest sounds were coming from outside my tent. I have never been a heavy sleeper, and the noise maintained a faint yet frighteningly crackling, as if someone was breaking wood apart. I stepped outside my tent and into the moonlight. A shadowy figure stood just on the edge of the campsite with a dim glow protruding from his face. I knew it to be Elior. He appeared wide awake, and I wondered where his gaze fixated. I did my best to make my footsteps as silent as possible to avoid disturbing the others. Elior turned slightly as I came to stand next to him. I did not realize the chill the night in the wilds held until my teeth began to chatter. Before he said a word, Elior threw his fit and flare frock around me. The warmth of the overcoat settled my chattering, but my face could still feel the briskness of the incoming breeze. "They are on the move," Elior whispered to me. He pointed down the cliffside where, to my disbelief, I saw trees stirring and shifting from one place to another. "The land is changing," I uttered, scarcely believing my eyes. "Are they alive, or is it magic that stirs them?" "They are mysterious creatures," Elior answered. "Mystery is an element of our existence. The source of this clandestine can only be found in exploring beyond what one is willing to believe. Even then, the more we know, the more questions are presented to us." "You, yourself, are something of an obscurity," I stated. Elior's response was nothing more than a smirk at first, but he responded, keeping the pleasantry of the conversation. "I could say the same for you, Miss Agnea," Elior sighed. "I have been around long enough to know that magic is nothing more than a part of the story waiting to be played out. There is a reason for the unknown in this world, just as much as there is a reason to draw breath and to dream. The trees move because magic is part of the story, despite what things may have or not have been before." "I have always been fascinated by magic," I blurted out, much louder than what would be considered polite in a crowd full of sleepers. "Everyone has a story in them." Elior turned to me, his eyes lighting up like the noonday sky. "But not everyone is brave enough to explore their narrative and allow it to manifest." I sprang up from my wilderness bedding, wondering if my encounter with Elior that night was real, but I heard several perturbed voices outside my tent. Zenobia was not beside me. I jumped up and quickly put my boots on. When I emerged from my tent, the boisterous lot became dumbfounded by the sight I had witnessed with Elior. Although the trees were still on the move, the MKR was nowhere I could see. The captain and Zenobia were entirely composed, standing next to them early in the morning. "Pipe down!" Bartus barked to the younger explorers. I thoroughly enjoyed watching them whimper like younglings about to be spanked. It made them less intimidating than the tongue-lashing I received from the elite intellects the night before. Only Nonasha was not scared. At least he did not show it. While the others were still cringing at the trees moving and murmuring amongst each other, Nonasha separated from the pack about 6 or 7 paces. I decided to approach him gradually, staring with the same awe and wonder I had in my heart when I first saw the trees move during the night down the cliff. The trees had all but scattered away from the landscape, migrating to another location. When I peered down the hillside again, standing next to Nonasha, I saw Elior in the distance, his silhouette outlined in the rising sun and his feet planted on the bare ground where the forest once stood. "You study this kind of thing?" I heard Nonasha break the silence. "I have, but only in theory," I replied. I had yet to see it with my own eyes. "What do your studies tell you about trees moving around as we do?" Nonasha pressed. "Stay away from them, if you can," I said. I saw a smile spread across Nonasha's face, almost as if I had drawn a laugh. Yet he did not make a sound. We both turned to see the others were breaking camp, and somehow Elior was back in our midst. We were ready for another day's journey, and Elior pointed the way. We followed tracks where the trees had travelled for a time. Then our course took us away from their prints. The ground remained barren for many hours, with only grassland and a few colourful flowers in sight. The skies overhead soon crowded with dark, fluffy clouds swiftly forming to block the sun. All of us knew what was coming, and within a few hours, the massive downpour split over us. An unusual rain, a sweetly scented aroma lulling us to drowsiness, and a stickiness that made us feel like honey pouring over our skin. "We need to find shelter," I heard Elior's urgency over the noise of plummeting rain crashing and soaking the ground. "Stay awake!" No sooner did he say this did Pramyan collapse into slumber. The soldiers and veteran explorer next to him swiftly caught his body before he fell to his face. A howling began to echo in the distance. I speedily reached and held tight to the grip of my drill gun as we hurried to find shelter underneath the cliffs. The once faint howls began to grow louder. Bartas kept shouting at everyone to pick up their feet, and anyone who stumbled would be left behind, while Elior persisted in ensuring no one was straggling. Whatever was chasing us in the storm, none of us wanted to learn its appearance. Yet we did not have much of a choice.